So we're doing American history as it relates. We're doing American history as it relates to physical education, exercise science, and sport.
Oh, for sure.
And I'm related. Okay. Introduction. Physical education, exercise science, and sport are all deeply rooted within America's history, each being significant at different points in time and evolving into what they are today. 1865 through 1889. What was this era like? This era was the beginning of systemic racism in the country. This is because the newly founded freedom of African Americans in America. This was the result of the Confederacy being defeated by the Union. At this time, much of the country was in Reconstruction. 1865 through 1889. How did this era influence the development of sport, physical education, and exercise science? This influenced the creation of segregated sports, such as the Negro League. This was a baseball league specifically for African Americans. They were significantly underpaid and less funded than their all-white counterparts. College football also began to gain attention during this time.
1900, the end of World War I. And what was this era like and how did it get that way? The war broke out in Europe in the summer of 1914 and was, at first, the U.S. was neutral. U.S. citizens were killed. That led to the U.S. declaring war on Germany on April 6, 1917. And then when men were drafted into the war, women began working in factories and taking over the jobs that men were doing while they were fighting. And the U.S. declared war because of the sinking of the Lusitania when the U.S. drawn to the sides of the Allies. In 1900, the end of World War I continuing. Sports competitors became popular during this combat breakouts. And competitions, athletics like swimming, tennis, etc. were welcomed as changes like fighting and people over a war. They were doing sports past the time.
In World War I to 1930, what was this era like? The Progressive Era was a period of time of widespread social activism and political reform across the United States that spanned from the 1890s to the 1920s. The purpose of the movement was to address the problems caused by industrialization. While this was gaining momentum, Bayou exercises gained much popularity. With the invention of the burpee by Royal Huddleston, more people began to incorporate into their workouts of this genre. And then, the era was notable for dramatic expansion in the number of schools and students served, especially in the fast-growing metropolitan cities. The teaching of physical education gained the status of a profession during the 1930s, when normal schools were expanded into teachers' colleges and four-year teacher preparation programs.
1931 to 1950. World War II started and the United Nations became into play and they had their first meetings. The bombing of Pearl Harbor, which set the U.S. into war, and the U.S. just wanted peace for the rest of the world. The development of fitness was emphasized because many soldiers had poor physical education levels going into the war, which meant that they couldn't run and go and fight a battle as well as other countries who were more fit. So we modernized our way of physical education, which making physical education in schools and making soldiers have to pass tests to become in the military.
1951 to 1970, what was this era like and how did it get that way? This is when the Cold War began and civil rights movement was in play. Americans in Britain were worried that the Soviet domination was permanent, and this is when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, which was a big change in the civil rights movement. And then leaders in the African American community came together to kind of try to face the racial issues that were happening. How did this era influence the development of sport, physical education, and exercise science? There was steady growth in physical education in schools. They tried to ban racial discrimination and allow all kids of different colors to play sports together. They provided greater access and resources for families. And this was not in all schools, but in some schools they segregated. Segregation was outlawed in schools in 1954, but mass majority of the schools were not segregated until way later. 1971 to the present, what was this era like? How did it get that way? In 1980, President Carter and the U.S. athletes were not allowed to attend the Summer Olympics in Moscow because the Soviet Union wouldn't withdraw from Afghanistan, which led to the U.S. in a boycott of Summer Olympics games to protest the late Soviet Union in 1979. In the early 2000s, the Twin Towers attack happened and the stock market crash happened, which was a major financial blockade. A lot of jobs were lost and businesses were kind of closed down, and they were very financially unstable. And then in the present, of course, COVID-19 is happening. So it's affecting the world because it's an easily spread virus that if you aren't protecting yourself, you're not really stopping the precautions of like it not happening. And we don't have a virus yet or a vaccine yet, so it's like not kind of stoppable at this point. How did it influence the development of sports, physical education, and exercise science? In 1980, because of the boycott, 65 nations in total refused to play in the Olympics. In the early 2000s, because of the 9/11, MLB canceled entire seasons. Winter Olympics began to worry about worldwide events in an American city, and NFL postponed games. And then in the present, of course, because of COVID-19, seasons are either getting canceled or postponed. And if they are playing, then we have to take precautions like getting screenings before games and getting temp checks and wearing masks on or off the court. In conclusion, American history changed the way sports are today with segregation wars and the virus. Each era influenced how sports are today, whether it was good or bad. Each year we learned from the years before and we developed that way too into what we are today, and that just shows that the history of sports led us to where we are today.